This program is brought to you by the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies. This lecture is one in a series exploring the message of the Book of Mormon and its invitation to everyone to come unto Christ. The speaker is Royal Skousen. The title of this lecture is The Critical Text of the Book of Mormon.
Today we're going to be talking about the critical text of the Book of Mormon. And a lot of people, when they hear this term, wonder exactly what a critical edition of the Book of Mormon might be. Some people have misinterpreted it to think that it means something that's critical of the Book of Mormon. And in fact, when Farms first published the first critical edition of the Book of Mormon, it went out on one of the news services that at BYU a book critical of the Book of Mormon had just been published. Briefly, a critical edition of the Book of Mormon has two main objectives. The first is to determine the original text of the Book of Mormon. And I always add, when I say this, to the extent that it can be determined. And because, as we'll see, there are difficulties in obtaining what the original text was. Now, I might explain here what we mean by the original text. We are not attempting to figure out what the original language was. We would have to have the actual plates to do that. What we're referring to is the English language text that Joseph Smith received by means of the sacred interpreters that he was using. And there is evidence, as we will talk about, that Joseph Smith was apparently able to actually see words of English in this approach, or the methods that he was using. So that's one of our major purposes, is try to determine what Joseph Smith actually saw and then attempted to dictate to the scribes that were writing down what he was saying. The second aspect of this project is to then determine the history of the text of the Book of Mormon as it has changed over the many editions that have been published of that book. Now, as we look at the history of the text of the Book of Mormon, we discovered that there are changes which have taken place over time. Some of these are accidental. A scribe, in attempting to make a copy of the original manuscript, may make errors in that transcription. A printer, in setting the type for an edition, may make errors. These are accidental errors. There are other kinds of changes which are done on purpose. This would be chiefly editing, where you have individuals that look at a particular expression and say, well, this isn't standard English, and perhaps their goal is to have the text in a more appropriate form of English, and so changes will be made in that way. So the critical edition, as it turns out, will be a version of the Book of Mormon that's unlike the typical kind of version that you have. When you look at your current edition of the Book of Mormon, there are notes down here at the bottom, but none of them tell you things like, well, the 1830 edition, instead of reading this word, read some other word. There is not one place in this edition where it tells you what other readings might have been at earlier periods of time. This is, in essence, what a critical edition does. It typically has a text on a given page, such as here, and it has notes at the bottom, but the notes tell you how the text has changed over time. The term critical comes from a Greek word meaning to decide or to judge. And a critical edition is one that provides readings at the bottom of the page that allows the reader to decide what he or she might think would be then the correct reading. In other words, you're given a choice. Very seldom do you ever pick up a book that is done this way. Every book that you read, probably virtually every book you read, is a non-critical text. And it just gives you one version of it, and doesn't have variant readings. Well, someone might ask, well, why do we need a critical edition? And I would say that the average member of the church doesn't need a critical edition. Essentially, a critical edition is being produced for scholars who have need for the kinds of information about the history of the text and what the original language might have been. For example, researchers may be interested in studying the actual language as the book was revealed through Joseph Smith. You will find, for example, in that original language, there are a number of expressions which are not really appropriate for English. Some of these are non-standard English. They represent Joseph Smith's own speech of the time, which it represents a colloquial dialect of upstate New York English. And so there are things like the army of the Lamanites was a-marchin'. And this is not, of course, standard English, but the Book of Mormon was given in the English which was appropriate for Joseph Smith. One of the interesting things we have discovered is that in the original language there are expressions which were not characteristic of Joseph Smith's upstate New York English, nor were they characteristic of a King James style of English, much as we have in the standard English Bible. One of the things which we have found are Hebrew-like expressions, almost as if the book had been literally translated from Hebrew, and the result is something which is very bad English, but nonetheless occurs rather consistently in the text. One example of this is the way you express an if-then statement in Hebrew. In English, we say something like, if you come, then I will come. And the then is optional. You could say, if you come, I will come. In Hebrew, the literal word-for-word way you express this is something like, if you come, and I will come. Now, that isn't really understandable English. In the original text of the Book of Mormon, there are over a dozen of these if and expressions, all meaning if then. In fact, probably the most famous verse in the Book of Mormon, at least for missionaries, is Moroni 10:4, which in the original language reads, and if ye shall ask with a sincere heart, with real intent, having faith in Christ, and he will manifest the truth of it unto you by the power of the Holy Ghost. This particular use of "and" was removed in the second edition because it really isn't English. But it is an interesting example of the original language containing expressions that are apparently characteristic of the Hebrew language. A second aspect of this project, besides studying the actual original language, is, of course, to find errors that have occurred in the transmission. Most of the errors that have occurred in printing have been discovered. But the main finding, I think, of this project, one of the main findings, is to discover a good many errors that occurred when Oliver Cowdery was copying the original manuscript and producing the copy that he produced is called the printer's manuscript. The original manuscript is the one the scribes wrote down as Joseph Smith dictated. The printer's manuscript was this copy that was made, and its purpose was to take it to the printer. Joseph Smith, as you recall, lost 116 pages of manuscript. And like all of us computer users, you discover that you have to back up. And Joseph Smith learned his lesson the hard way, as most of us do with computers. And he then, of course, backed up the original manuscript by having this copy made. Well, unfortunately, the copy introduced errors. Oliver Cowdery, on the average, made about 3 changes per manuscript page. Now, these changes are not anything of any dramatic order. They're not ones that change the message of the book. But it is true, as we discover these, we find that the original reading made better sense, and so we try and get as many and restore these as possible. One example, let me give you, is from Alma 51 and 7. And the original manuscript reads in this particular passage as follows. I might point out they're talking about this. There was a recall election for Pahoran, who was the chief judge. And Pahoran wins the election. And it says then, the fact that he won it, says, caused much rejoicing among the brethren of Pahoran, and also among the people of liberty. Now, this is what Oliver Cowdery wrote. In other words, it made the brethren, the relatives of Pahoran, happy, and it made his political party happy, all the people that voted for him. When Oliver was copying this in the printer's manuscript, he switched pages right at this moment as he was copying, and instead of writing the word among, he looked very quickly at the word among, and instead of writing among, he wrote many. And so the way he had written it in the manuscript was, which caused much rejoicing among the brethren of Pahoran, and also many the people of liberty. The printer, when he got a hold of the printer's manuscript and tried to read this, it wasn't good English. It just had many the people of liberty, so he wrote in pencil right above many of. So that when he set the type, he finally put in, which caused much rejoicing among the brethren of Pahoran, and also many of the people of liberty. Now, this particular, our passage as it reads in the text makes it sound like it's a normal kind of election that we're used to. We vote for people, we're not that enthused that they win, so only part of the people that voted for the candidate are happy about it. I mean, see, it still sort of works in some way, but the original intent was not to say that only part of the people of liberty were happy about Pahoran's victory. So these are the kinds of errors that we're also looking for, attempting to eliminate. Finally, a critical edition will ultimately help us understand much more clearly the transmission of the text itself. Questions like, how did Joseph Smith translate? What kind of problems did the scribes have in listening to Joseph Smith? How did Joseph Smith pronounce some of the words? What were the printing errors that the printer introduced? What kinds of problems did the printer have in reading a given hand of a scribe? And finally, we want to make a study of the grammatical changes that have been made. Who made them? What were the assumptions of making these changes, and so forth. I have been involved in this project now for about 5 years, and we're at the halfway point of it. As I mentioned earlier, Farms produced the first critical edition of the Book of Mormon. This occurred in 1984 through 86, and that edition is still, I understand, available from Farms. There is a text, which is an attempt to give the original text of the Book of Mormon, and then there are notes at the bottom, many of them describing what the changes have been. This particular critical text, I would say, is quite preliminary. It was based on looking at microfilm copies of the manuscripts of the Book of Mormon, and you really ultimately have to look at special ultraviolet photographs or the actual manuscripts to be able to read certain things. In 1988, at a linguistics conference at BYU, I made a proposal that we make independent transcripts of all the manuscripts, that we take the major editions of the Book of Mormon and put them on computer, and that then we make computerized comparisons of the various versions so that we could get a definitive view of what the changes have been. So this is where we are. We're in the process of finishing up the first half of the project, and this is basically to get everything in electronic version. We have 2 manuscripts that have to be produced in what are called facsimile transcripts, transcripts that try and put on a sheet of paper exactly where letters are and so forth. We have 17 editions of the Book of Mormon that we have put on computer, beginning with the 1830 edition and going up to our 1981 edition. And the first half of the project has taken us 5 years just to get these things on computer. We did scanning of the printed editions, and you think scanning works just wonderfully and beautifully 100% of the time. You know, you can figure out what all these letters are, but unfortunately it's much more difficult than that. Some of those early editions were printed with poor type, and the letters are not clear to a machine trying to read them. To us, they're usually pretty clear, but if you have a B, for example, and just a little part down at the bottom is missing, it'll look like an H to the scanner. Even though when we read it, we just looks like a B because we're reading holistically, but the scanner's just reading one letter at a time. The second half of this project, we are going to be doing a number of things. We're going to be doing what's called a computer collation, a big comparison project of all the textual sources of the Book of Mormon. We will then create a large database where you can just look up any word and see how it was been used in all the different editions or any place in the book. And this is very necessary, actually, for studying the text and trying to figure out what it was originally like. Ultimately, we will create a critical text by selecting the appropriate readings, the ones that represent the original. We're going to try and do this without editing, that is, without actually typing it in again ourselves, because if we do this, we've created another text, another monster full of typos and other problems. So we don't want to create the 20th text here, although we are, but we're trying to prevent creating something that we have to spend 5 years checking. One important aspect of this project is to study what are called conjectural emendations. These are changes that we propose in the text based on considerations of logic, internal consistency, and the kinds of errors that scribes made. There are numerous places where we think there might be an error in the text, but all of the manuscript forms don't directly give us evidence as to what the correct reading should be. Let me give you an example. In Helaman 3:3, if you look at your current text, it reads, "And it came to pass in the 46th, yea, there were much contentions." Now it's punctuated so that it reads something like, "And it came to pass in the 46th, yea, there were much contentions." Now people have looked at this and said, well, is it possible that yea is really not yea, but year, and the R is missing? Well, if we look at the original manuscript and the printer's manuscript and the 1830 edition, all the editions, everything says yea. But there is good reason to believe that actually this is year. But to establish that, we have to look at evidence for it. We can't just say, well, I think this sounds good, I'm going to make this change. If we do that, we could make thousands of changes, you know. In fact, people have sent me things in the mail thinking, well, I think this is wrong, and this is wrong, and I've got a file of all of these. But in this particular example, we can provide evidence. For example, we would go through the Book of Mormon and look at how yea is actually used. And it turns out, when we look at yea, we find out that it's used to provide emphasis on something which has just been said. It emphasizes some particular aspect. And This one here, the yea doesn't emphasize anything. It's just sort of out there alone. So the word yea is not being used internally in an appropriate way here. But the other thing we look at is there any evidence that the scribe might have had difficulty writing the word year? Did the scribe throw off R's when trying to write year? And actually, there's about 20 examples of this where Oliver Cowdery, in trying to write year, ended up writing yea. Most of the time he caught himself and he'd put a little R in, just insert it. But there's one very nice example where in the original manuscript it read year, and when he copied it in the printer he wrote yea. And this is clear evidence that Oliver Cowdery has a problem. And so given those kinds of evidence, we believe that yes, this probably was year. Now note, by the way, this is a pretty trivial kind of thing. It isn't really going to change, our understanding of the book. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind when we talk about the changes, because some people, I think, have a very misconceived notion and have an idea, first of all, that the Lord would have somehow prevented any change from ever occurring. But no, the Lord has had people work on the text. They've tried to do their best, but human error does occur. Well, let me mention a little bit about what we know of these two manuscripts, because this has probably been the most exciting part of the project, is getting access to the manuscripts. There are two manuscripts. One is called the original, as I mentioned. This is the dictated manuscript. It was produced during the spring and early summer of 1829. Then after that part was completed, the printer's manuscript was produced. This is the copy that was made. The printer's manuscript was not produced all at once. They didn't just sit down and say, now we're going to make this copy. Rather, they produced the printer's manuscript as the printer needed material. But this nonetheless usually forced them about every week and a half to produce 24 pages of manuscript. The printer's manuscript was produced beginning in August of 1829, and probably in the early months of 1830 it was completed as the printing took place itself. Of the original manuscript, we only have about 25 to 30% of it. In 1841, Joseph Smith placed the manuscript in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house, the hotel that was being built in Nauvoo. About 40 years later, Louis Bideman, the second husband of Emma's, removed the manuscript from the cornerstone. The seal on the cornerstone had been broken over the years, and water had seeped in, and moisture and mold and had attacked the books, the manuscript, and other things that were there in that. The manuscript was probably been just placed in there, and what had happened basically is the very top sheets were preserved and the middle section was preserved, but the portions at the bottom where there could have been more water have been apparently almost totally destroyed. Louis Bideman handed out the better preserved sheets over the next 6 years. And most of them went to LDS people, and these sheets have ultimately ended up in the church's historical department in Salt Lake City. These sheets are extremely difficult to read because of the water damage. When you look at a typical sheet in normal light, you can just barely see some faint brown ink. The ink, black ink, turns brown over time. But even these are extremely difficult to read, and some of them, you can't hardly see anything on the page. In the early 1950s, or perhaps late 1940s, these sheets were photographed in ultraviolet light, and this brought out the ink for the most part. And so actually we rely more upon these photographs that were made to figure out what the original manuscript reads than the actual manuscript. The printer's manuscript, on the other hand, is virtually intact. We're only missing about 3 lines or so from the first page that got worn off. The printer's manuscript was taken by Oliver Cowdery when he left the church in 1838. Oliver died in 1851, and David Whitmer, he was at David Whitmer's home. In fact, that was his brother-in-law, and so as he was dying, he gave the manuscript to David Whitmer for David to keep, to safe keep. When David Whitmer died in the late 1880s, his grandson received it, and his grandson, after some time, attempted to sell the manuscript, and it was bought by the RLDS Church in the first decade of the 1900s. So this manuscript exists. It's difficult to work with it because it is the printer's manuscript, and this means the manuscript goes to the printer, and the printer started marking up things. They even cut part of the sheets and so forth. Fortunately, they pinned them back together, and so we have, 99.99% of that manuscript. Some of the things that we've discovered about the Book of Mormon from these manuscripts include things like we can show that the original manuscript is a dictated manuscript. That is, the person writing it is listening to someone else, because the errors that are made are the kinds that you would make by mishearing. For example, them and him are switched because Joseph Smith is apparently saying something like, "He saith unto him." And the scribe doesn't know, is it him or them? And so sometimes writes one or the other and then crosses it out and so forth. In fact, there are a couple places where I believe that we still have the wrong one. Or another example where it speaks about a reed, and it's quoting Isaiah, and it ends up being weed in the original manuscript. And weed and reed are really quite close, and weed is the more familiar word, and so these kinds of things occur. We have direct evidence that Joseph Smith could apparently see the spellings of names. Witnesses to the translation said that Joseph Smith, when asked, would spell out names, unfamiliar names, to the scribe, so the spelling would be correct. And we can find evidence in the manuscript of this process taking place. My favorite example is from Helaman 1 and 15, where Oliver Cowdery first writes Coriantumr. He hears it, Joseph Smith pronounces it, and he writes it, and he writes at the end T-U-M-M-E-R, Coriantumr. And then the words crossed out, the whole name, and after it, on the same line, which shows it was immediately done, it wasn't something they came back to later, it's written as we have it in the book today, ending in T-U-M-R. Now, when Oliver wrote that M-R, he wrote it, he put M, and then he put R, and he put a big swirl on that R, which he does nowhere else in any of the manuscripts, and it was like, how could you expect me to spell this? And you couldn't. Even if Joseph Smith had said Coriantumr, no matter how slow you do it, you will not, people in English people would have always written M, some vowel, R. So to get M-R, Joseph Smith had to have spelled it out letter by letter. And so we find evidence of this, and this suggests, too, that the control which Joseph Smith had over that text was much better than people who believe that Joseph Smith just got ideas in his mind. He had to have, at least for names, gotten in his mind the actual spelling to be able to do this. There is some evidence that Joseph Smith was dealing with about 20 to 30 words at a time. And we can tell this by the a tendency for the scribe to sometimes get ahead trying to keep up with Joseph Smith, and he might skip a portion, and then we can calculate how much he skipped and what he was trying to do. And apparently Joseph Smith would sometimes read off too much at a time. And what I've discovered is any time you go over about 10 words, people have a very difficult time giving back any more than 10 words at a time. And some of these would suggest like 25 words. Joseph Smith read off 25 words at a time. He got carried away, and of course the scribe couldn't keep up with it and made certain kinds of errors. One of the most surprising findings of this project is that the original manuscript was used as the printer's manuscript, the printer's copy, for about 72 pages. About 3/4 of the way through the printing, all of a sudden the printer's manuscript wasn't being used. Instead, the original was being used. We have fragments from the original manuscript in this place, and those fragments have the pencil marks that the printer put all over the manuscript when he got the copy in his hand. And I've tried to think through, well, why would they be bringing in the original? And my conclusion has been that the three brethren that were responsible for producing the printer's copy, they were also the ones in charge of really the whole project. They were Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery and Hiram Smith. And Joseph Smith wasn't even there. He was down in Harmony, Pennsylvania. And they would go in every day with the portion of the manuscript. The printer would work on it, and they would take it home at night. And then apparently at night they would spend their time copying so that they would have material ready for the printer when the printer needed more. My theory is that they came to a place where they fell behind and hadn't produced enough of the manuscript. And so they had already gone 3/4 of the way through, and they decided to take in the original. And they didn't have a backup. They did, though, try to catch up. And eventually they had both Oliver and I believe it's Martin Harris working together on different portions so they could catch up in the copying process. Well, this is actually very important for the critical text project, because when you have two first-hand copies of something, even if you don't have the original or very much of it, you can usually figure out what the original said. Because if the two copies agree, then you can be fairly sure that that's what the original said. Where they differ, one of them's probably right. Now that's the hard part. Only one of them's right, and you don't know which one it is. But there are other things, but at least you have a choice. And see, for the rest of the Book of Mormon, you only have one copy of the original manuscript. The printer's is the copy, and then they take the printers to the press, and the 1830 edition is a copy of the printers with changes. But for those 72 pages, they typeset from the original, and so we're excited about the possibility of being able to fairly well recover the text for those 72 pages, even though we don't have much of the original there. People have asked, will these discoveries eventually appear in our printed scriptures? And the answer is yes. And the Church Scripture Committee is well aware of the results of this project, and we have been making plans so that they can receive these results and make them a part of the text as we get the information. For the remainder of the time, I would like to show you some of the slides that we have of the manuscripts and what they might represent, and some of the discoveries which we have had in this project. So if we'll shift to the slides here, we'll Okay, this first slide is an example of a critical text. This is not English, but this is the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, Latin language Bible that Jerome translated. And this portion up here is called the text itself. The editors of this text have basically tried to put here what they believe Jerome actually decided upon when he made his translation. Now you see, we don't actually have Jerome's original manuscript. All we have are copies that were made over the following centuries. Down here we have notes that show different forms. For instance, in verse 22 it refers to a particular word, and it says a manuscript S has this form, and manuscripts I, A, and K have this form, and so forth. And so this is what we mean by a critical text. This is called the apparatus, and these are the variants. But up here there is a particular form chosen by the editors. Okay, the next of these, this is the first critical edition that Farms produced in 1984 through 86. Here we see the text beginning with the title page of the book, and here are some notes. Some of the notes do not deal actually with the text, and some do. For example, this says prophecy spelled with a C and spelled with an S here. And so sometimes they give just spelling variants as some of the variants. One of the really important discoveries of this project was to conserve some fragments of the original manuscript. Louis Bideman gave out, we thought, all that he had of the original manuscript, but we discovered that he had kept back some small fragments for himself. When he died, his son Charles Bideman owned these. And in 1937, a collector by the name of Wilford Wood from Bountiful, Utah, was back in Illinois, and he met with Charles Bideman and discovered he had some fragments of the original manuscript, and so he purchased them, and then Wilford Wood just kept them in a plastic box for the next 40 or so, 50 years. Now he died, but his two daughters kept these materials and didn't touch them, which was very fortunate. In about October of, I believe it was 1991, the time passes quickly, Richard Glade, the grandson of Wilford Wood, brought these fragments down to the BYU library to have them conserved and photographed. Here, this is Robert Espinoza, who is the head of conservation in the library, and he will be the one that will be opening up this bunch of fragments. Now, we didn't really know whether these fragments are really from the original manuscript. All we could go on at the time was that these are what the family believes they are. But Richard Glade brought them down in this box, in a metal box, and there's a plastic box that contains them. So the next, here we have Robert opening up the plastic box. Now, there is an 1837 Book of Mormon in this box. This 1837 Book of Mormon was also in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house, and is very badly damaged. But underneath, in a cellophane container, are these purported fragments from the original manuscript. And here Robert is taking some staples out. This cellophane was stapled at both ends, and so it'll be removed. And here then is what I call the lump. And these kinds, this is typical color for the fragments of the original manuscript, this brown color. I might indicate Mark Hoffman had a heyday with producing missing portions of the original manuscript, but his fragments did not have the appropriate color. In any event, you really can't see much on these fragments as far as writing. A little bit of ink here and there, but it's not going to be easy to read by visually observing the pieces. Now here Robert begins the rather tedious process of pulling these fragments apart. It's very fortunate, I think, that these things were actually preserved in this lump in dry Utah for the last 50 years and made it really rather easy to take apart the fragments without tearing them and without having them fall apart too much. So the first process is to get them apart in main portions. This particular piece of machinery here is a humidifier, and it turned out to be very important for our work, because many of these fragments, if you just had them in normal air and pulled them, as you unfold them, they'll just break. And so what you want to do is get moisture in them so that you can possibly get them unfolded without them breaking. And you could put them in here and you build up steam inside, then take them out, and you can work with them for about 20 minutes before they then dry out completely. The water evaporates and you have to put them back in. Here, one of the conservators, Kathy Bell, is taking out a fragment after it's been humidified. You can see the fog that's been built up there. This is Pam Barrios, also a conservator. She has a fragment here that she is unfolding. She's using an instrument that we call a spatula, not the normal one for flipping eggs, but it works. And here's a close-up of that. Actually, there's more than one piece. These fragments, very often, there were several layers of sheets that were together, and then they get folded on top of each other. One thing which we have to do is patching. Very often, we'll be working with these fragments, and they'll suddenly break apart, but we know they went together, and there's a little semi-transparent kind of patch that can be put on, and Kathy Bell here is doing some patchwork on a fragment to keep it together. After we had basically flattened these pieces, they've been unfolded and flattened, we put them in these envelopes, and then they were ready for the photographer to photograph. David Hawkinson of BYU's Fine Arts Museum is the photographer. He normally does photographic work on paintings and uses infrared photography and ultraviolet. And one of the things which he had to discover here was which process would be the best to photograph these fragments in to bring out the ink. We discovered that the infrared did not work, and the reason for this apparently is that there is no iron in the ink, that it was apparently just made out of vegetable material, and that doesn't show up for the infrared, but for ultraviolet it will. Fortunately, we got something, and David wasn't too confident that he was going to get much, but we did get something. The next series just shows you how a fragment can be all sort of squished up, and as we unravel the thing, we can get quite a large fragment out of it. So I'll just go through a series here. Here it is in the humidifier, this very same piece. As soon as it gets in there, it starts to relax when the water is absorbed by the piece. Here it's being teased apart. And it really was sort of amazing to us as this thing got larger and larger. And here is the final piece. This is opened up. As you can see, it looks blank. It is blank. And it turns out this particular piece of paper was not a part of the original manuscript, but it is a part, it's the cover for a petition. Lyman Wight, one of the 12 apostles, had written a petition to the U.S. government about the sufferings that he and his family had undergone while in Missouri. And in the cornerstone, they put one of the petitions. The one they chose was Lyman Wight's, and we found fragments of Lyman Wight's petition in this group of fragments that Wilford Wood had. Here is the photographer David Hawkinson, and he's preparing a fragment for photography. This actually is the Lyman Wight fragment. It is not a part of the original manuscript, but there is original manuscript stuff here. Here is a black or a color photograph in normal light of the Lyman Wight fragment. In fact, his name is right here, Lyman Wight. And down here is the statement of the county judge certifying that he had appeared before him to give this affidavit. Here is the ultraviolet black and white photograph of the preceding. You can see that you get the text coming out really very nicely. At least for me, it's very nice. Some people don't think this is very good, but it's all relative. We even did some microscopic photographs of the paper to analyze it, and this is the paper of the petition. I think I have another one in here. You can see the different types of paper. Oh, I might point out in this regard, Robert Espinosa went through all the little fragments that we had and tried to identify the paper type, because we found in all about 5 paper types in this collection. And if you know the paper type, then you have a pretty good idea that a fragment comes from a certain part of the manuscript from bigger fragments where you can identify those. And that helps us then. We don't have to hunt through the whole Book of Mormon if we can read a "the." We only have to hunt through 50 pages to find it. This is a photograph of some machinery used for encapsulating the fragments in mylar. We need to encapsulate them so that they can then be picked up and looked at without damaging them. They will preserve them for time. If later we need to photograph or analyze, we can remove this encapsulation. It's not lamination. When you laminate something, if it's laminated with plastic, that plastic adheres to the actual thing that you have inside it. But we don't laminate, we just encapsulate, which means you have a layer of mylar on top and underneath, and then when they put little points, they sort of stick it together around it and just hold it firm. And so this is how we conserve these pieces. Here's Robert Espinosa doing some final work on some fragments that have been encapsulated. This is a schematic drawing of the 2 manuscripts. This line represents the printer's manuscript, and as you can see, it goes from Moroni, or it goes from 1 Nephi to Moroni, and the line is solid and means we have basically the whole thing. There are some lines along here. These are where the punctuation marks were made by the typesetter. This line here represents the original manuscript and what we have. And the church basically has these long lines here. The Wilford Wood fragments gave us fragments from 58 pages of the manuscript, and they're in 6 different areas, and they're encircled here. There are 4 circles up here. This is basically in 2nd Nephi down through the book of Enos. And then we have some here from the end of Helaman and the beginning of 3rd Nephi, and then we have some from Ether. And so that's, you see it's rather spotty. We don't have the full manuscript at all. Now I'm going to show you a few fragments. This is a fragment that was all rolled up. and it sort of looks like, well, I won't say, but it was unrolled. It has not been flattened yet. You can see this big watermark in the middle of it, and here it is after it's been flattened. This is from 2 Nephi 7 and 8, and this shows you what the ultraviolet photography does. The other one, I don't think you can read much, but this one, you can definitely read it. It turns out that when Oliver Cowdery was copying this portion into the printer's manuscript, he made 6 changes. And what we find about Oliver is when he's copying, he goes along sometimes page after page, no changes at all, and then all of a sudden just bam, 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 he just starts making them. And this is an indication that he's getting tired. And so in this one little fragment as he was copying, he made 6 changes. And this is typical of copy work. When you're tired, you don't even know you're making mistakes. This is the paper from this portion. It is a very coarse paper. It's a machine-made paper. And by studying that, various aspects of the paper, we're able to determine that. Most of the paper is handmade paper in the Book of Mormon manuscript, but there's one section with machine-made. This is a fragment from 2 Nephi 25. This one is probably the best preserved. You can see some of the writing there. That one can actually be read without special photography. But you would much rather read it this way, in the ultraviolet. This is a reconstruction. If we notice this fragment right here, that is this fragment. Okay, but as we've gone through the other pieces and used the computerized scriptures and also a special computerized database, we're able to figure out all these other fragments, and there's a couple there, and put them in their right places. So that this was probably the piece that originally came out of the cornerstone, but of course it's all been broken apart in various years. We make of these fragments what's called a facsimile transcript. This is a facsimile transcript of what you just saw before. And this is the text of what it actually reads. If there's a word inserted, we put it right above where it actually is. Here in capital letters, we have underneath what we believe was written in the places where there are holes, where things don't appear today. So this is what we call a facsimile transcript. This is a fragment from the end of the book of Jacob. And you can't hardly read anything on this piece. And here we have it in the ultraviolet, and its very famous words at the end, brethren, adieu, the word that anti-Mormons love, because being ignorant of the English language, they think adieu is only a French word. Here is a fragment from the end of Helaman, and this is unlike anything else you've seen. Notice these marks. These are pencil marks, and those are the pencil marks for punctuation that the printer was putting in. The original manuscript had no punctuation. The printer's manuscript had very little, and so the typesetter put these punctuation marks in, and this is one of the proofs that the original manuscript is being used as the printer's copy. And here is the ultraviolet of that same. You can't see the printer's marks very well in this one. Finally, this is a fragment from Ether, and it looks like a piece of dynamite to me, almost with a fuse. And Robert Espinosa took this one apart himself. This is a reconstruction of what's in that. And you can see it here. We've actually reconstructed in a book-like version And the page I'm going to show you next is this center page. And we can figure out how it was put together. Notice that string coming out. Well, I've sort of reconstructed what it sort of was like. You're willing to look at that if you wish. And there's that centerpiece. And there's the ultraviolet. This piece is very hard to read, even in the ultraviolet. I just want to close by referring to my own testimony of the Book of Mormon. My testimony of the Book of Mormon is not based on the work that I've been doing in this project. I think it has been very interesting to have discovered things which support what witnesses said about the translation, that testify that indeed this really is a revelation from the Lord. My own personal witness of the Book of Mormon comes from an experience I had while reading the book 15 years ago, when the Spirit witnessed to me that the events that I was reading about had actually happened. And I'm grateful for that spiritual witness of the book. I think that is the crucial testimony that we all desire. But it has been of great personal satisfaction to me to see all of my academic work being put to good use, and to find direct evidence for things like the spelling out of names and what Joseph Smith really had to do to be able to translate this book. It's my witness that this book truly is a revelation from our Heavenly Father, and it is for us. And my prayer is that we may read it in that light. And, you know, we learn things from these details that give us understanding. But ultimately, it's that spiritual witness which is the one which really gives us the solid foundation to believe in the book. Thank you.
For more information about the Book of Mormon and other related topics, call 1-800-327-6715.